Good evening, everyone. Janet, thank you for the introduction to the folks with Fair Districts. Thank you so much for inviting me to share what happened with Gwinnett County's local redistricting. Without a doubt, I would say this was probably one of the ugliest political experiences that I ever went through. And I think it's very unfortunate because there was an opportunity to have gotten this right. In fact, in looking at fair districts, four principles when it comes to local redistricting, we got 3 out of the 4 correct, the first 3, but unfortunately, as y'all may know, the Georgia General Assembly did not follow its own rules or respect the local map. But really, going to the next slide, this whole saga began during the 2021 special session last fall. Now, Governor Kemp's floor leader, Senator Clint Dixon, who is a member of the Gwinnett delegation, ended up becoming the only state legislator to introduce local redistricting during special session. This was a map drafted behind closed doors, and it only had the support of Republican members who comprise a minority of the Gwinnett State House delegation, which is the second largest in the state of Georgia. This proposal would have essentially doubled the size of local government in Gwinnett County, diluted the power of elected officials of color, some who made history, and would have stripped the power of the county chair. It was astounding in which they tried to move this map through the legislative process. They actually passed it out of the Senate Senate SLOGO committee. But because we were in special session and we were confined as to what matters we could address, I very clearly told them that they were either violating Senate rules or violating the governor's proclamation. So even though they broke either Senate rules or the governor's proclamation by passing this bill out, along with a school board bill, again, drafted behind closed doors with only Republican members who supported this initiative, we were successful in defeating this map that would have, frankly speaking, thrown Gwinnett County into chaos, especially when it comes to the size of local government, because it's not just a matter of increasing one county commissioner. You would be increasing the size of every single governmental authority in Gwinnett County. And so the unintended consequences would have just been incredibly concerning. Going to the next slide, after we were able to defeat this proposal, it became clear in my mind that we had one shot to try and pass fair maps. And so throughout this entire process, my motto for myself, for the Gwinnett delegation, which I also made public with conversations I was having in Gwinnett County, was fair process, fair maps. And so by fair process, I meant a process that was transparent and inclusive to create as fair of a map as we could possibly obtain. So after we defeated this Republican proposal during the special legislative session, Gwinnett County ended up having 5 open houses throughout the county in each of the districts to solicit public input. Through those 5 open houses, they drafted this map on the right-hand side, this proposed local map that made minimal changes to the current map, which you see on the left-hand side. This current map being drawn by Republicans a decade ago. But the thing that I was so impressed about regarding this proposed local map was not only that it made minimal changes, but it really did reflect the priorities of the public, which were 5. First and foremost, to keep cities together, to have zero voting precinct splits, to ensure that there was greater overlay or overlap with school districts, community improvement districts, and one other that doesn't come to mind. But this proposed map unanimously passed the Gwinnett County Commission on January 4th or 5th, I believe. And again, I was incredibly impressed because it perfectly reflected the priorities of the people from those 5 open houses. It made minimal changes to the current structure, which I think is always a good idea. And each of the districts reflected the diversity of Gwinnett County, creating a plurality white, Black, Asian, and Hispanic district that again demonstrated and reflected the multiracial diversity of Gwinnett County. So I was excited, and I thought that we actually had a meaningful opportunity to pass what I consider to be an objectively fair map. So going on to the next slide. So after the Gwinnett County Commission completed their process, of course, it was now up to the state legislature. As chair of the delegation, I'm a part of, I'm one of 18 members in the House. There are 7 senators who represent Gwinnett County. And so for us to do our part, we decided to have 2 public meetings in the months of, during the month of January. And so I think this map really illustrates kind of what happened here. So again, on the left-hand side, you have the current map, which is currently in effect. In the middle, you have the proposed map from the local folks. And then on the right-hand side, you have the adopted state map, which was proposed by Representative Bonnie Rich. Now, when you look at the adopted state map, that is the map that folks will be running on, it looks very fair, and it is clearly more compact than any of the other maps. However, it is the map on the right that makes the most radical changes. And I'll come back to that term, and I'm very intentional with using the term radical, but it makes the most radical changes compared to the current structure of local government in Gwinnett, which does have implications to Gwinnett County voters. Now, going back to process, you know, I did everything possible, and members of the Gwinnett State House delegation did everything possible to compromise, to negotiate with members of the Republican Party, specifically Chairman Bonnie Rich, who served as chair of the reapportionment process. In fact, I essentially gave her all the information for the county's map and provided Republican members and all members, frankly, 20 days to review and to offer any amendments or you know, to let me know what changes that they would want to see. Now, keep in mind that 20-day time frame in my mind is important because that's essentially the exact, approximately the same amount of time that the Republican majority passed congressional, state house, and state senate maps. Unfortunately, rather than negotiate with myself and the local folks in particular, who I was advocating for, instead of working with us and negotiating with us in good faith, just as the local map was about to hit the local calendar, they hijacked the map. My assertion was that they broke House Rule 18.2, in which once you have the requisite number of signatures for a local piece of legislation, it should automatically be added to the local consent calendar and voted on by the entire body. For decades, that has been the process for local redistricting in particular. Under both Democratic leadership and Republican leadership, everyone deferred to local delegations as to what local redistricting should be. And that makes sense. And it demonstrates a greater affinity to democratic principles in which ultimately you want people to have the freedom and ability to determine the course of their county, certainly within their own home, or certainly in the county in which they call home. So, you know, we were blindsided essentially by this Republican proposal on the far right. Chairman Rich made this map public on Monday. Within less than 24 hours, they passed it out of the Governmental Affairs Committee, which was the first time in decades that that happened. The very next day, it was passed through the Rules Committee. And before I knew it, here we were on the House floor on February 3rd, earlier this month, voting on this Republican map that had no meaningful public scrutiny, in which Gwinnett voters did not know what was going on, given how rapidly they were forcing this new Republican map. Now, the one thing I will say about this map is, and y'all may have heard some of the strong language that I use to characterize this map, but the only reason why they drew that northern district was to create a majority white district, as unfortunately it seems that is the only way that the Republican Party can win, especially in a state or in a county as diverse as Gwinnett, but certainly around the state at the federal, state, and local level. We have seen them, the 6th congressional district in particular comes to mind, that they will move voters of color and replace them with white voters and for political purposes, which I find just abhorrent, frankly speaking, especially when there was a map with minimal changes that reflected the priorities of Gwinnett County voters. Going on to the next slide. So this is a lot of information and detail, but this, and down here, this paragraph or two at the end was from the minority report that I gave on February 3rd, talking about the demographic differences of the proposed map compared to the original map, or to this new map that is now going to be in effect. So Gwinnett County, if some of y'all do not know, is diverse, and it's not just black or white. It is multiracial, so 35.4% white, 29.8% black, 21.7% Latino, 12.5% Asian. The original map from the local folks reflected that diversity and ensuring that there wasn't a single racial group that had a majority, right? And so the original map really reflected and embraced the diversity of Gwinnett. If you look at the population summary on the right-hand side, which is of this adopted state map, you could see in District 4 that it creates a district with 50.82% white, a 50.82% white voting age population, which is contrary to the demographics of the county. It is disproportionate, especially in light of how the demographics have evolved over the past decade. But it was really just astounding in which they broke decades of precedent to forcibly create this majority white district in Gwinnett for political gain. Going to the next slide. The other great concern that I had with this map was that it diluted the political power of Black, Hispanic, and Asian American communities, as you can see by the data, but I think the visuals also provide a greater understanding of how that occurs. So on the top left-hand side, you'll see that the current map that's in place. And if I could direct y'all's attention to the southern part of Gwinnett County, you can see that it literally splits the Black community in half in the southern part of Gwinnett, where there is the greatest concentration of voting age voters, which is what that map in the middle shows. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see density by subdivision, which again was better captured in the original proposal from the Gwinnett County Commission on the bottom left-hand side. But really when it comes to the Black community, to see how visibly, how this map to create that majority white district is splitting the Black community, again, I just thought was absolutely appalling. Going to the next slide, you see that similar effect again within the Hispanic community and the Asian American community. But with the Hispanic community, you know, again, if we're looking at the the western side of the county in which there's the greatest concentration of voting age Hispanic voters, which is most clearly reflected in the map on the right-hand side, that shows, again, race and ethnicity by county division. This is from Statistical Atlas, which y'all can go to online. But it shows that large density of Hispanic voter or Hispanic residents between 27.5 to 32.2%, which again, if you compare that subdivision map to the original map really captures fully and gives the Hispanic community an opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. And I will note that there has never been a member of the Hispanic community ever elected to the Gwinnett County Commission. The first Black person ever elected to the Gwinnett County Board of Commissioners was in 2018. Commissioner Marlene Foscue, who is now at risk of being unseated because Republicans wanted this, again, broke decades of precedent to try and force themselves back into a county after Gwinnett voters overwhelmingly voted to have all Democrats represent the county commission. Going to the next slide, looking at the Asian American community, again, you see a greater concentration on the northwestern side, most clearly visible in the race and ethnicity by county subdivision slide. Again, you see how the current map splits the Asian American community right here in that corner in the original state map. Going to the next slide, I think that might be all of my slides. So before, and maybe I'll take questions at the end, I'll turn it over to you, but the last thing I'll say is, because of how rushed this legislative process was, in which the majority party gave the Gwinnett County Commission only one public hearing, I have continued to receive additional information from the county as they've completed and conducted their analysis. One of the most astounding things, which I just found out last week after Governor Kemp signed this map into law, is that 140,000 Gwinnett County voters will not be able to vote for county commissioner this year. All right. So Republicans can get one seat on the Gwinnett County Board of Commissioners. 140,000 Gwinnett voters will have to wait until 2024 to vote for county commission. This map, again, going to the radical nature in which it's creating that northern district where there had not been a northern district for decades. 40% of Gwinnett voters, more than 250,000 voters, voting schedules being disrupted. But again, about 19% or 139,000, 140,000 will not be able to vote until 2024. And another 120, 130,000 will have to vote again after 2 years. But the last thing I'll say is, with everything that's been going on with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and being so consumed with this fight in Gwinnett, if you had told me that, someone would have broken decades of precedent to forcibly impose, someone that they want in power at a certain place, you would think that sounds like an autocratic entity engaging in such action. But to have experienced and have, gone through such a ugly, hyper partisan power grab, to experience that in Georgia, in which we, especially in this moment in time, should be trying to demonstrate, allegiance to democratic values, American values. To have experienced this again, I thought was just so incredibly unfortunate. But with all of that said, Janet, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Representative Park. Very interesting to see the maps and the details behind the dilemmas over the last several months. With that, if you have questions for Representative Park, I see a couple already in the chat. We will be doing questions with our two speakers at the end. So please go ahead and either put them in the chat or hold them, and we'll come back for that. I'm going to turn it over now to Ken to introduce our next speaker and continue on with our program. Ken?
Thank you, Janet. And we have another redistricting rock star with us tonight, which is Rahul Garabadu. I have the pleasure of introducing Rahul again for the second time. He was on a program of ours last year. He's the voting rights staff attorney at the ACLU of Georgia. He litigates cases involving voting rights and provides his expertise regarding state and federal election law. He is passionate about protecting the right to vote and ensuring that elections across the state are free and fair. Rahul's a native of Georgia. He went to Harvard Law School and Georgetown University, so has his credentials behind him. I'll say that what excites me about Rahul is that he's the man in the room, just like Representative Park is the man in the room where it happens. He has been litigating one of the cases. He is the lead attorney. Remember last month in our town hall, we talked about 5 cases that were filed alleging various violations against minority representation in the maps for State House, State Senate, and Congress. Rahul is managing one of those cases, and we're going to do a deep dive into that case tonight. There's been very active participation in the court in the last month, a month and a half. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rahul, who's going to give you the inside scoop on one of the cases. And it's going to be very interesting to see what's going on. Thank you, Rahul, for joining us again.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to Fair Districts of Georgia for having me back. As Ken mentioned, I was here on a panel right before the redistricting process began, not too long ago, although it does feel like several lifetimes ago, considering everything that's happened on the redistricting front. Like Ken mentioned, I litigate voting rights cases across the state. And I'm honored to be here today, and I'm honored to talk to you a little bit about some of the redistricting litigation that's going on in Georgia. Now, as some of y'all know, and as Ken mentioned, there are many cases that have gone to federal court in the last couple months, 5 by my count so far. But today I'll be talking a little bit about the lawsuit that the ACLU and its partners are litigating right now, and that's Alpha Phi Alpha v. Raffensperger. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. So we are representing plaintiffs across the state, including 2 organizational plaintiffs, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity plaintiff. Alpha Phi Alpha is the largest and it's the oldest fraternity that is on campuses across the country, and is the first fraternity to have Black members in the United States. We are also representing the 6th District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest and largest Black churches in the country and the world. In Georgia, the 6th District has over 500 congregations across the state. And finally, we are representing individual voters around the state in our litigation. Our lawsuit is challenging the state legislative maps, the State House and the State Senate maps under the Voting Rights Act. This is in contrast to other cases which are being litigated right now. There are some cases that are challenging congressional maps. There are some cases that are suing the state on constitutional grounds. But our case is what's called a vote dilution case. And what that means is we are alleging that the power of Black voters specifically is being weakened by the maps that were passed by the state late in 2021. So the bottom line here is that, you know, our theory of the case in the nutshell is, given the explosive growth in Black population in Georgia over the last 10 years, that there should have been and could have been more Black majority state legislative districts that were drawn. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to show as kind of a backdrop what Black population looked like over the last 20 years in the state of Georgia. And as you can see, there's been about a 1.1 million population increase in what's called the AP Black population. And that's a census designation that refers to any part Black. But as you can see on the bar chart right below that, the number of Black majority districts in Georgia has remained about the same since the 2006 redistricting cycle. It's hovered between 13 and 14 seats, despite this explosive growth. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that trend is true in the House seats as well. So despite a huge growth in Black population in the state of Georgia over the last 2 decades, the number of Black majority districts in the state has basically been frozen, across the last couple of decades. And if we go to the next slide, this is kind of previewing what I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But one of our demographic experts said this line in court, and I thought it encapsulated the issue perfectly. He said that it's kind of impossible to understand why there are not more majority Black House and Senate districts in the state, given all of the growth that has been happening over the past 30 years, but especially over the past 20. So that kind of gives you the background of what Black population in the state looks like. And of course, that's not the full story, right? That's there's more to it than that, but that kind of gives you the background conditions of where we're litigating. So if we could go to the next slide. In order to succeed in court under a Voting Rights Act claim, we have to prove what are called the Jingles preconditions. And these preconditions are 3 factors that have to be met in order to go forward in a redistricting case under the Voting Rights Act. The first precondition that we have to meet is that we have to show that there is a sufficiently large and geographically compact Black population that could comprise a majority in new districts. So simply put, that means there have to be Black voters in numbers and in a geographic area that could be drawn as a new district. The second precondition that we have to meet is that Black voters are politically cohesive, that in the jurisdictions that we're looking at, Black voters are voting similarly. And then finally, what we have to show is that blocks of white voters are preventing the election of Black preferred candidates in elections. So we have to show what's called racially polarized voting. And then once we prove those Jingles preconditions in a vote dilution case, we have to also zoom back and look at what are called the totality of circumstances. And we have to show the court that looking at political opportunity for Black voters in a broader context, or whichever minority group you're looking at, that there is less of a political opportunity, less of an opportunity to participate in the political process for the group that you're looking at. And once you show these factors, you're able to prove what's called a vote dilution case. You're able to show that there is a presumptive violation of the Voting Rights Act. So before I talk a little bit more about this, I wanted to show you all the timeline of this litigation so far. So if we could go to the next slide. So as many Fair District supporters will know, the Georgia General Assembly convened to draw the new state legislative and congressional maps starting on November 3rd, 2021. And then, looks like we lost that slide. So the Georgia General Assembly met starting in early November. After a very, very quick process, the final congressional maps were passed out of the Georgia legislature on November 22nd of 2021. And the Georgia General Assembly adjourned at that point. And then 38 days later, the governor finally signed those maps into law. So there was a long gap between when these maps were actually passed and when the governor signed them, and nothing changed in between. There was just a very long delay. But almost as soon as the governor signed those maps into law on December 30th, almost minutes after that, lawsuits were filed on the same day, including the Alpha Phi Alpha lawsuit. And then about a week later, the plaintiffs in our case, the litigants, filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, which I'll talk about in a moment, to block the maps that were passed by the state. So things were happening for the most part very quickly in this litigation, except for that 38-day delay between when the maps were actually passed and when the governor signed them into law. Things have been moving very quickly, which brings us to what we were doing in court over the last month or so. So if we could go to the next slide. So the reason that our case was in court recently was to have a hearing on our motion for preliminary injunction. And what a motion for preliminary injunction is asking the court to block the implementation of the state's maps because they likely violate the Voting Rights Act. So that means before we get to a full trial on these maps, we're asking the court to block them. And the reason that we're asking the court to block these maps is because that there are certain factors that play which would make the harm with these new maps irreparable. The right to vote, there's no amount of money that can compensate a voter for violating their fundamental right to vote. Once an illegal election is held, you can't turn the clock back on that. So that's why we went into court in early February to present evidence on why these maps needed to be blocked before the primary elections took place in Georgia in May of 2022. So we were on an expedited schedule. This is much faster than any court will usually start looking into the merits of the case. Usually litigation is a very, very slow process that takes months and months and years even. But we got into court because we are alleging that these maps should not go into effect in 2022. Specifically, what we are raising in this motion is that the state could have drawn more Black majority districts, but they did not. Specifically, that there could have been 3 more Black majority state Senate districts in the southern metro Atlanta area, as well as the exurbs of Augusta, based on population growth in those areas. And that there were at least 4 more majority Black state house districts that could have been drawn. Also in the southern Atlanta area, in the Milledgeville and Eatonton area in Georgia, as well as the southwest corner of the state between Thomasville and Albany. So we are asking the court, and we presented evidence earlier in this month with expert testimony, with fact witnesses, that these maps could have easily been drawn in a way that complied with the Voting Rights Act, but because they did not, that the court needs to step in and block these maps from being implemented. These hearings started on February 7th and they went through February 14th. And we had gotten through 1 full day of the hearing, presenting evidence, hearing expert testimony, when we were hit with some breaking news. And if we go to the next slide, on the first day of the hearing, after we were done at around 5 o'clock that day, the Supreme Court ruled on an Alabama redistricting case. In January, so just a week or so before our hearing started, a 3-judge panel had unanimously ruled that the Alabama state legislature could have drawn a second Black majority congressional district pursuant to the Voting Rights Act. So it was a case under the Voting Rights Act that was asking for the court to step in and block the maps in Alabama. And the court agreed. And it was a 3-judge panel that included appointees from who had been appointed by Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. And they unanimously ruled that Alabama needed to go back to the drawing board. It was appealed immediately, and the Supreme Court was asked to stay the decision, which means put the decision on hold until it can go through the full litigation process where it's fully briefed. And in a 5-4 opinion, the Supreme Court granted Alabama's application for a stay. So they put the lower court's ruling on hold. They said that Alabama does not have to redraw the maps to draw a second Black majority map. So that decision came in on Monday night. And then our case kind of changed completely in the middle of our hearing. And the judge in our case asked us to address this new Supreme Court ruling and how it impacted Georgia. And so we spent the next couple of days talking about how the Alabama case and the Georgia case were different. A common refrain that came up was Alabama is not Georgia, not least importantly because Georgia has a national championship in football that Alabama does not. And that was one of the things that one of my co-counsel mentioned. And but more importantly, that there were important differences in the way these cases were litigated and the evidence presented that showed that Georgia could implement relief in this case with the time that we have before our primary elections. We heard from a lot of elections administrators in our case who came and testified in court and talked about how these changes could be, if the court rules that the Voting Rights Act has been violated, that elections administrators could implement these changes. Not saying that it would be the easiest thing in the world, but the amount of time we have between now and the election in May gives us ample opportunity to make sure that that these maps are drawn in a way that complies with federal law. And so that's what we presented to the court, and that's what elections administrators told the court as well. And the reason why this is so important is because a lot of times what the state's response has been to any allegations under the Voting Rights Act has been that it's too late for this election. We're too close to this election under a doctrine called Purcell, which relates to election law. There was a case back in 2006 or 7 where the Supreme Court said that courts could not make substantial changes to election laws right before an election. And that doctrine has been used by defendants in a lot of cases in a lot of states to say that we're too close to an election. And while that might be the case sometimes, we argued that that's not the case here. And there's no one free illegal election rule that you get when you're drawing these maps. You can't always resort to administratability when it comes to the rights of voters. So that's what we argued. We'll see, we had a lot of evidence presented that this was feasible, that this could be done without too much hardship on elections administrators, and that this is important, that these districts need to be drawn in a way that complies with federal law. So if we could just go to the next slide. One other thing I wanted to mention was that we had an amicus brief that was submitted by none other than Fair Districts Georgia and the Harvard Law School Election Law Clinic. And we were very appreciative of that amicus brief because it weighed in on another important issue that came up in this hearing. As part of our lawsuit, what you're required to do when you allege a Voting Rights Act violation is you're supposed to provide an illustrative map that shows that these violations of the Voting Rights Act, that there could have been a map that was drawn in a way that did not commit these violations, that there could have been more majority Black districts that were drawn. And what the amicus brief that was submitted by Fair Districts and the Election Law Clinic showed is that you could do this in many different ways. There are a lot of ways to skin the cat here. And it, you can see in this little excerpt that's on the slide that there were thousands and thousands of simulated plans that these parties drew up in a matter of days, which could keep Georgians in the similar House districts and also comply with the Voting Rights Act with the same number of majority Black districts that we've proposed and comply with federal law. And that the illustrative map that's been submitted on our part is not the end all be all. And the state legislature will get a second chance if we're successful to draw these maps in a way that complies with the Voting Rights Act. But there's a lot of ways that can be done. And so That was an important voice, and we were glad to see that that brief was submitted as what's called a friend of the court brief, where outside parties offer kind of their technical knowledge to weigh in on an issue that they might not be directly involved in. If we could go to the next slide. So that brings us to where we are right now. Right now, we're waiting on a decision that could come any minute now on this preliminary injunction, whether these maps should be blocked before the May primary begins. It'll determine whether we'll see any relief before the 2022 election is underway. But I should mention that later on there will be a full trial on the merits of the case. This preliminary injunction was heard on a very quick basis, but we'll go through the normal process of discovery. We'll go through the normal process of kind of the usual track that litigation takes to go to a full trial, in the coming months. But this decision that will come out, either today or within the next couple of days, will tell us if there will be any changes to the maps before the May primary. So that's where we are now. I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Rahul. That was great. I think we're going to turn now to Brooke White, who's going to talk about our call to action, and then we'll have a Q&A shortly thereafter. Brooke, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks thanks Ken, and thank you again everyone for being here tonight, and to Representative Park and Rahul for speaking. So all is not lost, hope is not lost. Please, if you aren't familiar in what's happened in your county, your city, make sure you look into that. Reach out to your elected officials at all levels to express your support for fair and transparent redistricting, and let them know what you think about what's happened in your community. But most importantly, talk with your neighbors about what's going on. So many people are going about their lives not really tuned into what's going on, and once people are aware of this, I think they are just as disturbed as many of us are. So and invite them to join you in reaching out to elected officials. And you can also submit an op-ed to your local newspaper. That's another great way to have your voice heard and get the word out in your community. More on all of these action items are in the redistricting toolkit. The link is here and it has been posted in the chat a couple of times. And again, thank you for your time and for following up on these important items.
Okay, with that, we're going to switch to have a question and answer session. And I know that Anita, our question monitor, has been collecting the questions as you've been putting them in the chat. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You can address them to either Representative Park or Attorney Rahul Garabadu, or just generally, and we'll have somebody take the questions. Anita, if you've got some questions queued up, maybe we should take a few for Representative Park first. I think we have about just a little under 10 minutes. So if you can spotlight everybody, thank you. And then Anita, do you want to pop in the first question? Just read one of the salient questions that you have, and let's get some answers.
Great, thank you, Ken. For Representative Park, they all basically are asking, are these redistricted maps legal, and can the ACLU sue Georgia? And I think we already have that answer. They're trying best they can. Representative Park, someone asked, is there a possibility that continuing growth in the county population of Gwinnett and the changing voter demographics, et cetera, may actually make these outrageous gerrymanders, this gerrymander effort, ineffective in fairly short order?
Yes, I think it's a good question. I do think the demographics of Gwinnett will eventually overcome these artificial districts. Of course, the primary concern that I have with this current map is that Commissioner Marlene Foscue is put at an unnecessary disadvantage. In the original proposal, she essentially offered to put herself in the 50-50 district. Well, now she's in a Republican district, and so to lose her, an insurance executive of 25 years, the first Black woman ever elected to the Gwinnett County Commission, I think is incredibly unfortunate. I'll be doing everything possible to turn out folks to help ensure she has an opportunity to continue to serve. But real quickly, going to the first question as to whether or not litigation is going to be filed in Gwinnett, I think that is going to be up to the various voting rights organizations. Though, of course, compared to perhaps the state legislative map, as Rahul had discussed, there is an additional complexity when it comes to Gwinnett, which is that it is coalition districts that the 11th Circuit has recognized, though, because of there being a circuit court split, my understanding being that would likely go up to the Supreme Court, which is risky given the current composition. So even if there isn't necessarily legal recourse, and if the demographic shifts eventually allow Gwinnett to be made whole, I think ultimately this is an issue that will have to be decided by Gwinnett voters at the end of this year and over the next election cycle.
Okay, so you're not expecting any litigation at the Gwinnett level?
We'll see. I think if anyone would file suit, it would likely be the lawyers committee, just because they had previously filed litigation in Gwinnett and are familiar with the county. That's my understanding.
Okay. One more thing. Someone asked, shouldn't your statistics show changes in proportions rather than just changes in counts?
Is that a question for me or for Rahul?
That was a question for you, Representative Park, and I think they're referring to the bar graphs and the line graphs where you're talking about the population changes. I think the question really gets to, has the proportion of voters changed materially in terms of the demographic makeup, this very diverse world that you live in Gwinnett? And I think if the question, I think the upshot of the question is, if you look at it on a proportional basis, would you see the same dramatic growth in the proportion of diversity versus just the absolute numbers of population?
You would see the exact opposite. The greatest amount of growth that we've seen or experienced in Gwinnett County is from the Asian American and Hispanic communities. And I believe we've seen the white population decrease by 10 to 15% over the past decade.
All right, so it kind of mirrors Georgia, although you're like mirror Georgia on that respect then, right? So
I was about to say, in case that question was for my line graph and bar chart, it's similar in the case that white voting age population has decreased slightly over the last 10 years at least.
Okay. All right. I think the next one is probably for Rahul. Someone asked, given the recent preliminary decision by the Supreme Court in the Alabama redistricting case, do you think there is any chance that the Georgia litigation will succeed?
Yeah, I think there are. So this goes back to kind of what I was talking about, the differences between Alabama and Georgia. And there are some differences in the cases that, that there's some daylight between the cases that offer some hope here. The main thing is that in terms of the Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court ruling came through what was called the shadow docket. So there was no official written opinion in that ruling. It was just a granting of an application for a stay. So that doesn't constitute precedent in the way that we normally think of it. The only written guidance we have from that action is a concurrence by Justice Kavanaugh, which only one other justice on the Supreme Court signed on to, Justice Alito. So we only have two justices on the record who have articulated a new test about when preliminary injunctions that are close to an election should or shouldn't be granted. And even using that test, which, again, all we know is that two justices have agreed to that. We don't know how three justices feel about that, but even using that new stringent test, we provided evidence to the court showing that the relief that we're seeking is both feasible. It could be done on the timeline that we have in the run-up to the primary elections, and that there are different factors here at play than there are in Alabama. So because of those reasons, we remain hopeful about our chances for success in the preliminary injunction stage. But even if we go to merits trial, we still think that there are factors in play that give us hope.
Great, wonderful. Someone asked, is it true that Governor Kemp waited until the very last minute to sign his approval for the maps because he knew that Georgians would be upset?
Is that question still for me, or?
Honestly, I think we all know the answer to that. But
Well, it is for you, Rahul. It's your 38-day delay question, right?
Yeah. So obviously, I don't know, what was happening in those 38 days. What I can say is that in an already shortened redistricting cycle, it made it even more difficult. We moved at extremely fast pace in this litigation, but those 38 days, we could have used each and every one of them. So that delay definitely did hurt in terms of the ability to challenge these maps.
I'm going to post one last question to both of you, actually. I think it's a relevant question in both cases. So what was the justification provided for the map? So in Representative Park, Representative Rich came in and wanted a different map. What was the justification? Well, why did they want that? And Rahul, in your case, I'd ask the question, how does the state respond to this challenge, right? You said that we think it's appropriate to draw additional Black majority districts. So what was the state's response to that? Was there some compelling state interest that they cited that said, well, here's why we shouldn't do it? So Representative Park, handle it for the Gwinnett case first. What was the reason? What's going on here?
So in Gwinnett, Chairman Rich said that the local map being proposed was an extreme partisan gerrymander and that it would disenfranchise voters in the northern part of Gwinnett, which could not be further from the truth. But that was a justification that she continued to provide.
Okay.
And on the litigation front, the striking thing is we didn't hear much of a response to why there weren't more majority Black districts drawn. The response that we heard in court was a lot about kind of poking holes in our illustrative map, the map that we provided as an exemplary map that could be used to redraw state legislative maps. But again, we stand by our maps and we think that they could be used, starting tomorrow. But at the end of the day, that's not the end of the road. The state would get another crack at it. And as the amicus brief showed, there are a lot of ways you could draw this map. So we didn't really hear much of a response as to why more majority Black districts weren't drawn.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay. Well, I know we're just a couple minutes over time, and I think we're going to call it. Thank you, everybody. We will have another town hall at the end of March. It'll be on March 28th. We're posting a link in the chat to a survey for this town hall. We'd really love to have you fill out that survey before you leave tonight. We love to get your feedback. We do try to make these town halls informative and useful. So please check out the link in the chat for the survey. As always, we appreciate your support. We don't do a lot of fundraising, but the funds that we do collect from these events really do help us move forward on many fronts and produce some of the reports that we produce and run these programs. So we're on PayPal, and we also accept Venmo. That's our Venmo handle. You can follow us. If you have any questions, email us. You can see the email address up there. We're on Twitter. We are on the Facebook. Our website, of course, is fairdistrictsga.org. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I want to thank again our two rock star speakers, the guys in the room. I'm sure we'll be hearing more in the coming days about both of these situations. We will endeavor to send out, we will be sending out a newsletter to our followers every month. Typically, we'll do the newsletter in the middle of the month, and we'll have these town halls at the end of the month. And so in our newsletter, we will give you updates on anything we know about either the Gwinnett situation or the case, the lawsuits that are pending in federal court. So again, thank you everybody for joining. It's been a wonderful evening, and have a good night now.